Good evening. You're watching the breaking news. Tonight's special report focuses on inflation in Indonesia, an issue that has affected millions of people and continues to influence the country economy. Over the next few minutes, we will examine Indonesia's economic background, understand what inflation is, explore why it happened, discuss its effect, and look at the measures taken by the Indonesian government to control it. Let's begin with our correspondent reporting live from Indonesia.
Thank you, Tengku Irene. I'm reporting live with the latest update on Indonesia's economic condition. Indonesia is the world's largest archipelagic country, consisting of more than 17,000 islands. Today, Indonesia has a population of approximately 2,085.7 million people, making it the fourth most populated country in the world. Every year, the population continues to grow by approximately 2.2 million people. This large and young population creates strong domestic consumer demand. Because of this, maintaining price stability has become one of the country's most important economic priorities. Indonesia's economy is mainly supported by three major industries. First is manufacturing, contributing around 18.98% of the country's GDP. Second is agriculture, contributing 30.07%. Finally, mining contributes around 10.09%. Although manufacturing and mining has slowed slightly in the recent year, agriculture remains relatively stable. The Indonesian government is now focusing on strengthening this industry to transform Indonesia to a leading global manufacturing hub. Indonesia has also achieved stable economic growth. After recovering from the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, GDP per capita increased steadily. More recently, after a strong recovery following the pandemic, Indonesia's annual economic growth remains stable around 5% throughout 2023 and 2024. This shows that Indonesia's economy remains resilient despite facing various global economic challenges. Trade performance has also improved. Between 2025 and 2026, export increased to $92.15 billion, while import reached $86.51 billion, resulting in a trade surplus of approximately $5.64 billion. Manufactured products continue to dominate export, while import mainly consists of capital goods and consumer goods. Employment has also shown positive improvements. Indonesia is currently experiencing what economists describe as a demographic bonus, where the majority of the population is of working age. The national unemployment rate decreased from 5.56% in 2017 to 4.91% in February 2024. However, youth unemployment remained relatively high at 12.24%, showing that many young graduates still face difficulties entering the labour market. Tengku Irene, despite these encouraging economic indicators, inflation continues to remain one of Indonesia's biggest macroeconomic challenges. Back to you.
Thank you, Nasuha, for the detailed report. Although Indonesia has experienced stable economic growth and stronger trade performance, rising prices continue to affect consumers and businesses. But what exactly is inflation? To help us understand this issue, we are joined today by economic analyst Dr. Zana. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for having me. Inflation. What is inflation? Inflation refers to a persistent and continuous increase in the general price of level of goods and services within an economy. When inflation increases, the cost of living also increases. As a result, consumers experience a decline in their purchasing power. In simple words, the amount of money can buy fewer goods and services than before. This is often refers to too much money chasing too much few goods. There is also an inverse relationship between inflation and the value of money. When inflation increases, the value of money also decreases.
Thank you. May I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Have Indonesians experienced inflation before, or is it only happening right now?
Actually, Indonesia has experienced inflation for many years. One of the most significant periods occurred during the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998. The crisis caused severe economic instability and sharp increase in inflation. Following the experience, Bank Indonesia introduced the ITF, which is Inflation Targeting Framework. The purpose of this framework are to maintain price stability by keeping inflation within a targeted range. Besides the inflation targeting framework, the Indonesian government also introduced several measures to control inflation. One of it is Harga Eceran Tertinggi, which is HET, which sets a maximum retail price for selected essential goods such as rice and the cooking oil brand Minyak Kita. Although this policy was introduced to keep price affordable, rice price continues to increase in the following years.
Thank you, Dr. Zana. So we now understand that inflation is more than simply rising price. It affects that purchasing power of consumer, influence the most value of money, and remain one of the most important economic issues facing Indonesia today. But what actually caused inflation in Indonesia? Is it because production costs are rising? Or is it driven by increasing consumer demand? So now, we will examine the different types and causes of inflation in Indonesia, including cost-push inflation and demand-pull inflation. Thank you, Dr.
Tengku Irene. Let's begin with cost-push inflation. Cost-push inflation happens when the cost of producing goods and services increase. According to Bank Indonesia, there are three important factors contribute to cost-push inflation. The first one is exchange rate depreciation and import dependence. The second one is volatile food price and supply shock, and the third one is government administered prices. So now let's examine each factor. The first one is exchange rate depreciation. In 2013, Indonesia faced a major economic challenge after the United States Federal Reserve announced plans to reduce the monetary stimulus. This announcement caused Indonesia, which including global investors, to withdraw their money from many emerging economies, including Indonesia. At the same time, Indonesia experienced strong domestic demand. Imports increased while exports weakened due to slower global economic conditions and falling commodity price. As a result, Indonesia's current account deficit reached 3.9% GDP during the third quarter of 2013. The Indonesian rupiah gradually weakened throughout the year. In the third quarter alone, the rupiah depreciated by 8.2%, while exchange rate volatility increased significantly. Because the rupiah became weaker, imported goods and imported production materials become more expensive. This situation creates what economists call imported inflation, where higher import costs eventually cause domestic price to increase. Thank you. Certainly, demand pull inflation happens when the demand for goods and services increase faster than the available supply. In Indonesia, this usually happens during Ramadan and Idul Fitri when people spend more on food, transportation, and celebration. As demand increases, price of essential goods such as rice, cooking oil, and beef also increase.
Dr. Fazana, how did Bank Indonesia respond to the situation?
Alright, so Bank Indonesia introduced a strategy called dual intervention. The central bank intervened the foreign market while also purchasing government bonds in the secondary market. In addition, the minimum holding period for Bank Indonesia certificates was shortened from 6 months to 1 month to attract foreign investors. As a result, the current account deficit improved to around 2% GDP and the depreciation of the rupiah slowed down.
Thank you, Dr. Zana. Besides exchange rate movement, Indonesia also experienced inflation because of food supply disruption. In early 2013, bad weather and stricter import restrictions affected the supply of imported agricultural products. Products such as garlic and beef became difficult to obtain. When food supply decreased, price increased rapidly. Although seasonal harvest temporarily reduced price during April and May, the overall risk remained high because food products make up a large portion of Indonesia's consumer price index. To improve the situation, the Indonesian government relaxed import restriction, removed beef import quota, appointed Bureau of Logistics to stabilize price, and replaced the quota-based import system with a reference price system. I'm now at a local market. With me is Miss Christina, who has been selling groceries for many years. Miss Christina, have rising production costs affected your business?
Yes, definitely. Now, the important question is, how does inflation affect the people and the economy? To answer this, let's once again hear from our economic analysis, Dr. Zana.
Thank you, Tengku Irene. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. Some groups benefit from rising prices, while others suffer significant losses. Based on our findings, inflation in Indonesia creates 3 major effects. The first one is redistribution of income and wealth. Second, effects on the balance of payment. Third, discouraging investment and savings. So now, let's begin with the first effect. Redistribution of income and wealth. Inflation changes on how income and wealth are distributed among different groups in society. People living in urban areas who earn fixed salaries are usually the biggest losses. This is because their income does not increase as quickly as the price of goods and services. As living costs continue to rise, their purchasing power becomes weaker. According to the data, Indonesia's urban poverty rate increased slightly from 6.66% to 6.73%, while the poverty line also increased. On the other hand, rural food producers experienced the opposite situation. Indonesia, farmers' term of trade, also known as NTP, reached rupiah 123.45 in February 2025, indicating better earnings for farmers. As a result, the rural poverty rate decreased from 11.34% to 11.03%. These results show that inflation can create both winners and losers within the economy.
Thank you, Doctor. To better understand how rising prices affect daily life, let's hear from someone who experienced this change directly. Nasuha?
Thank you, Tengku Irene. I'm back here at the local market with Mrs. Nina. Mrs. Nina, have you noticed any changes in your customer spending habit because of inflation?
Yes, definitely. Many customers now spend more carefully. Some buy smaller amount of rice, cooking oil, or meat because prices have increased. They often ask whether prices will go down soon. As a trader, I also face costs from suppliers. Although business continues, both sellers and customers have become more cautious in their spending.
Thank you, Mrs. Nina. Tengku Irene, this situation clearly shows how inflation reduces consumers' purchasing power and changes their daily spending behavior. Back to you.
Thank you, Nasuha. Inflation clearly affects households and businesses. However, its impact does not stop here. It also influences Indonesia international trade. Dr. Zana, could you explain this further?
Certainly, another important effect of inflation is its impact on the balance payment. When inflation becomes high, domestically produced goods become more expensive. As a result, Indonesian exports become less competitive in international markets. At the same time, imported goods also becomes relatively cheaper. According to Bank Indonesia, this situation worsened the country's current account deficit. For example, during the first quarter of 2021, Indonesia recorded a current account deficit of USD 1.0 billion or 0.4% GDP. By the fourth quarter of 2025, the deficit had widened further to USD 2.5 billion or 0.7% of GDP.
The next important question is, how does Indonesia control inflation? To answer this, we will now hear from the representative of Bank Indonesia, Ms. Afika.
Thank you, Tengku Irene. To control inflation, the Indonesian government and Bank Indonesia work together using three main approaches, which is the first one is the monetary policy, fiscal policy, and lastly, direct control. Let's begin with monetary policy. Monetary policy aims to reduce the money supply in the economy. When there is too much money circulating, people spend more, causing prices to rise. Therefore, Bank Indonesia uses several monetary tools to control inflation. The first tool is open market operation. Bank Indonesia buys or sells government securities to control the amount of money circulating in the economy. When inflation becomes too high, Bank Indonesia sells government securities to absorb excess liquidity. The central bank also intervenes in the foreign exchange market to stabilize the value of the rupiah. For example, in 2023, after the United States Federal Reserve maintained high interest rate, Bank Indonesia introduced the Certificate Rupiah Bank Indonesia, which is known as SRBI. Through this policy, Bank Indonesia sold SRBI to absorb excess liquidity while attracting foreign capital. This helped keep inflation close to its target of around 2.5%. Thank you.
Besides open market operation, what other monetary tools are used?
The second tool is the statutory reserve requirement, also known as the mandatory minimum reserve policy. Under this policy, commercial banks are required to keep a certain percentage of customer deposit as reserve at Bank Indonesia. This limits the amount of money bank can lend to the public. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Bank Indonesia reduced the reserve requirement to 3.5% to support economic recovery. However, when inflationary pressure increased in 2022, the reserve requirement was gradually raised to 9.0%. This absorbed a large amount of money from the market and helped reduce inflationary pressure.
What about interest rate?
The third monetary tool is the buy rate, which is Indonesia benchmark interest rate. When inflation becomes too high, Bank Indonesia increases the buy rate. Higher interest rate encourage people to save more and borrow less. As spending decreases, demand also decreases, helping to stabilize the prices. Following the COVID-19 pandemic and global supply disruption caused by the Russian-Ukraine war, Bank Indonesia gradually increased the buy rate throughout 2022 to prevent imported inflation from becoming worse.
Thank you, Ms. Afika. Besides monetary policy, the government also applies fiscal policy to reduce inflation. Could you explain this?
Certainly, fiscal policy reduces inflation by lowering aggregate demand. The government mainly does this in two ways. First, decreasing and restructuring government expenditure. Instead of providing fuel and electricity subsidies to everyone, including higher income households, the government shifted its spending towards targeted assistance for lower income families. This included cash transfers and programs to stabilize food prices. The government also carefully managed spending on civil servant salaries and bonuses to prevent excessive demand in the economy.
Besides monetary and fiscal policy, Indonesia also uses direct control. Ms. Afika, could you explain this?
Direct control is when the government directly controls market prices through legal regulation. One example is the highest retail price, which is known as HET policy under the Minister of Trade Regulation number 57/2017. HET sets the maximum selling price for essential goods, such as rice, sugar, and cooking oil to keep them affordable. This policy is especially important during supply shortage, such as those caused by El Nino, to prevent sudden prices increases.
That concludes Breaking News Special Report, Inflation in Indonesia. Thank you for watching. I'm Tengku Irene, and on behalf of our team, thank you and goodbye.